Okay, I think we have the technical issues all resolved here, so I'm going to start so we don't get running too far behind. Technical issues make it such that I'm going to be saying next for the slides, like it's 1980 something, or this person back there at the actual slide. Awesome. Yeah. So this is my presentation for Agile, a architecture for a more agile Fedora. I say architecture here, but it's important to note one of the things that kind of came out in discussions. This is a policy architecture, not an OS design architecture. So when I've got diagrams of things, those are not OSI model application layer kind of things. This is about how we put Fedora together and how we structure ourselves. So next slide, please. Yeah, so start with problem B. Start with the problem statement here. I think probably everybody who's in this room at this point already knows a little bit what I'm talking about in here. Like next slide here. I want to start still with saying what's some things that are good about Fedora. Fedora really is an awesome distribution. This is a great conference here with great people. We have really solid engineering and great technology that goes into putting our distribution together, and we have a community of people who love what we're doing and so much great stuff. I was talking to people last night who work on translations in Fedora, and there's a whole global community of people doing really great things in this project. So we want to make sure that we recognize and retain all of that. Another strong thing we have is we have very high standards. Some of those super high standards are part of our problem as well, but those standards are also part of our success, and they've definitely been part of the success of Red Hat and Red Hat Enterprise Linux as a downstream distribution. Really, the high standards in Fedora have made that what it is, so that's great. We have the best enthusiast distro. Not everybody in the world recognizes that, but it is actually the fact. Chuckles there. And another thing that we do well, Fedora is a solid base for RHEL. Every RHEL release comes out of Fedora very nicely. Sometimes the sausage making process is ugly, but the end result has been reliably beautiful every time. So that's a success for Fedora, and another thing we need to make sure we continue to build on. And this is a little plug for the stuff I'm working on myself. We do have a pretty decent cloud image. Again, not everybody in the world recognizes that yet, but we'll work on that. So those are some things we're doing good at putting together. Next slide. But we really need to be more than what we are right now. If we just continue in the path we're going, we are going to become less and less relevant, and eventually nobody will be using Fedora, and that is generally bad for anybody who wants to come to this conference. So here are some of the specific things. I see it's not widely used by RHEL users, which as part of that ecosystem is a failure. It would be nicer if people who are using RHEL in their production environments would also be using Fedora in the places where it fits, for their test beds, for their the desktops of their geeky IT people should be running Fedora. There's a lot of places where Fedora should fit in. What's that? Yeah. So
great. Are you using it like a combination of RHEL for production and for development?
Yeah. Good for Yahoo. In general, I was going to talk about applications on Fedora. Fedora has not been that great for building on. If you want to be part of Fedora, you have to be in Fedora, and we don't have a very good model for being something on Fedora, and basically very few people do things on top of Fedora, which is, again, dooming us to irrelevance, because the layer at which we are working is kind of becoming boring, and all the interesting stuff is at higher layers, so that's we need to expand in some ways. That includes the other projects that Red Hat is working on. Red Hat is more than just a Red Hat Enterprise Linux company, and there's a lot of things at cloud layers and middleware stuff that is other products that our own company. A lot of us work for Red Hat, not everybody does. But the sponsor of Fedora needs Fedora to be useful to all of Red Hat, and we're not very good at that. And it would be it is a sign that we are not very good to the whole world if even our own closest relatives feel like it's not very useful. So that's why I have that point there. Even if we're looking at it from a Fedora point of view and don't care about Red Hat at all, it's a bad sign. In general, Fedora is not seen as very relevant and exciting, and it would be nice to be relevant and exciting. So Next slide then. So here's the, I wrote this a long time ago, and I've talked a lot, haven't really refined this, but this is the basic idea. We refocus the core distro as basically a platform, and then we have layers of modules on top of that that enable things that people actually want to do, and we have a solutions-based approach to what we're selling. Next slide. So I had this idea of rings, and probably a lot of people have seen this already. So start with this ring 1, where we draw give or take by default right now. That's just kind of an example because that's something we have to start with. And in my example here, I suggest that we include all the tool chains needed to build all of that. I'm not actually convinced that that's necessary because if you start with that, everything in its standard, it's like 300 packages right now. And if you recursively go through everything needed to build that, it goes out to like 3,000. And I'm not kidding. So that makes it too large. So some of that could be broken up into how the Perl stuff is built, and we could look at fighting that, but it might be better to not try and focus on making it self-hosting and to make the developed environment a separate thing. Yeah, like I said, the line could go elsewhere. That's an implementation detail. But I think it's important that we draw that line and make that here's what the base design is. It's not just something we have a vague feeling about. We actually have a design thing in the core. In that core area, we have most strict change management. That doesn't mean we're opposing all change or that change necessarily needs to be very slow, but we want to make it happen on purpose in coordination with everything else, and so it serves the needs that everything else that's there for. And so that probably means we have packaging standards that are like the current Fedora, and the change process that's basically like the change process we have with some further refinements to meet the new model. So this isn't really very dramatic, anything at this point. So the next slide. Yeah, so this is, again, this is what that ring 1 is. Base functionality that everybody can expect. This is what we talk about when we say it's Fedora. It means it has this at its heart. Making this distinction for this ring 1 lets us focus engineering resources. We know what it's there for, what things we should be talking about, and people who are building on top of it know, okay, this is a base that we can rely on to be there. Next slide as well. So here's my picture. I call it Fedora Core in this presentation here, which I know is a little bit controversial. Next slide here. So as I was talking about this idea, as it was kind of an infant idea, I was talking to a lot of people, and it really became hard. There's a mosquito trying to eat me while I'm getting ready to talk. So it became hard to talk about it without saying Fedora Core by accident. And so I was talking to Seth Vidal about this, and about whether we should try and come up with a new clever name or something for it. And he said, look, people are going to mumble in the back of the room, you're just going back to the old bad days of Fedora Core, but they're not admitting it because they got this new fancy name. And he said, we should just call it Fedora Core, and then we'll have the conversation about how that's different, rather than having a conversation about what it's called. Because that came from Seth, at this point I'm kind of attached to it, but we don't really, the name isn't really that important. The important thing here is that in the old days of Fedora Core and Fedora Extras, which a lot of people in this room were around for and some people weren't, Fedora Core was basically not an open source project. It was developed internally to Red Hat, and the open source project was you can do things around the fringes, and it wasn't even quite clear what the fringes was. The core was whatever Red Hat needed. And it actually happened that the community developed really high standards and code review and a lot of process and things that weren't going on in the core. And when those things were finally merged, all the packages in core went through this Fedora Extras code review, and the quality of that code went up a huge amount. So that was a really good thing that happened, and that's part of why RHEL is as good as it is. That was a good process. And so a lot of those values that came from the community are important, and it's just that we had it a little bit backwards, where we had the community and those high standards on the outside ring, and we really need the community across everything, so community at all levels, and we need the high standards in the inside ring, and a little more flexibility, not necessarily worse standards, but more flexible standards as we kind of go out from that core. So going in from the core a little bit here, I also suggest a ring 0, which is basically the minimal install. This is to provide a juice image, just enough Fedora, which is useful for a lot of deployments where people really, really want something minimal. We haven't actually had much stress on minimal as disks get bigger and become sort of irrelevant. So I think it's probably useful to have that minimal ring 0. I can go to the next slide here. Within the Fedora core, where we can talk about, this is what this looks like. But one of the things, there are some new cloud operating system things which are basically just the kernel plus systemd and basically nothing else, which is interesting. But I think we still want to have something where this core is something that you can take, you can install, and then you build other components from Fedora on top of it, and that's what makes it Fedora, and not just some random binaries that you installed from somewhere. So it's minimal, but still Fedora based. So was there a slide before that? No? Okay. Nope, there wasn't. Awesome. We ordered these a little bit. Okay, so up to that point, I think generally there's not a lot of controversy in whether having a good base design is a useful thing. So going on to the part 2 here, I'm going to go back to the problem. We need to be useful to people. People who are building on top of Fedora need this reliable base, but they also need more flexibility in areas that are relevant to their own stuff. So how can we design something that gives that? Next slide. Don't panic as we're going on here. This is a vision for the future. We do need to start on this now because there are some things that we need really soon. But everything this thing isn't, especially as we get up to the applications layer that I'm going to talk about in ring 3 further on, like the stuff to do this isn't here yet. So what we need to do is work on this so that it can be here in a future that we're getting to, but we don't want to just throw everything out tomorrow and start all over with everything in a crazy way. So we're going to have a plan to get there, but don't want to go completely insane, just slightly insane. Next slide. All right, so here's a picture of ring 2. There's the core and the ring stacks and environments ring outside of this. And again, this is a policy model. It's not necessarily an OS layer model. So this is basically how we structure, what rules apply, how things can be put together. Basically, we have some default expectations, and the rings give the different SIGs and different groups a way to replace the default expectations with expectations they need to solve their own problems. We can have separate policies in each of these rings, but we also want to have a whole thing that ties it all together and say, this is Fedora, this is a coherent thing that makes sense. We're a community, and we all work together on something. Next slide. So ring 2 is environments and stacks. Environments are basically where you run the code you care about. This is what the user or developer kind of sees. And stacks are collections of software which are used by the software. These are my general terms here. And they're sort of technology agnostic ideas of what we can call these things. So pretty vague terms. And you can argue about what's an environment, what's a stack a little bit, and it's not important to argue about this in terms. Next page. So environments would include desktop environments, ideally with app containers, because I think that's the way of the future. As we want to have more untrusted apps, we want websites are more dynamic and they run JavaScript and all sorts of dynamic code that could break things. We want to have things that work in a very containerized way. That's the way of the future. For non-desktop environments, the same thing. OpenShift gears basically are container environments, or they will be going in that direction. They're kind of a really clever SE Linux hack at this point. But basically, the same thing for non-desktop applications. Running them in a container is kind of the way of the future. And so we want to design something that supports that nicely. But there are also cases where people just want to make an appliance where they take the core image and they put stuff on it in whatever way they want to do it. And then when they want to do the next one, they build another one up from scratch like that. So that's another kind of environment that's different from these, but we also probably want to support. Next slide. Stacks are basically languages, databases, libraries. Maybe we put X kind of stuff in here in the stack kind of thing, especially as we're going between here's your. If we want to make both of those possibilities at the same time, doing them as a stack kind of makes a way so you can choose between those things if we start migrating. In general, when I talk about stacks, it's the kind of things that are in software collections. which is a technology that some people, Red Hat engineers, put together basically to use RPM to package up different language versions in an alternate tree and make it fairly easy for applications to choose to use that language version. And OpenShift cartridges, which Andy Grimm is going to be talking about next talk, are the way that OpenShift makes these things available to code. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about stacks. Yeah, so for example, here's some of the things that will be in the Spring 2, Perl, Ruby versions, Python, Java, all these things. I also have a thing here called Fedora Commons, which I'll talk about a little bit. Toshio, I was going to make the font bigger. Is Toshio here? No. Suggested that the font on that be bigger because that's also important. Next slide. So this is some examples of things, policies that might apply to things in Ring 2. Maybe bundled libs are okay. There's been a lot of talk about bundled libs. Basically, this is versions of libraries that are part of this part of the application or part of the stack that duplicate something else. They, often they're slightly forked and it's a huge mess. Sometimes they're just the same thing copied again, but in a way that's part of the application. Or maybe it's a slightly different version where this application requires a specific version of it. We know, I come from a sysadmin background, I know that this is terrible. We don't want that as an end goal. But it's one of those things where worse is ultimately better as a survival thing because everybody is doing this. And if we don't allow it, basically all we're doing is closing our eyes and saying this isn't allowed, and everybody else is like, really, that's not there, I just have to do it myself. So we're not really providing, we're not actually making things better for anybody because people are still doing it because they need it for their actual stuff to work. So when we say you can't have bundled libs, all we're saying is Fedora is useless to you. You're going to have to do it yourself. So we need to find a better solution to this. And so I think that by allowing bundled libs in some way, with caveats like if you have a bundled lib, we identify it and we know where it is and we know where it came from. Especially in cases like the software collections where we're talking about duplicated versions of things, but they're still coming out of our build system. We can track where they come from. We know what versions there are there, so it's easier to do actual software updates when the inevitable thing happens where that bundled lib has a security vulnerability. Another thing. Software at this ring could override software at a lower tier. A really important example here would be Puppet, where the version of Ruby that Puppet uses was too new for what Puppet actually could run with. The version in Fedora was too new for Puppet to work. So Puppet was completely broken in Fedora 17 and 18. And that's a fairly important piece of software that people really use that we just shipped broken because our stack was too new for the software to work. So we can't keep doing that. And so we need to have a way to have different versions of these things. So one thing, we could have a system version of Ruby that is basically there for things that are at the system kind of layer, like arguably Puppet is for a lot of people. And the versions there are meant to serve the stuff that we put at that layer. But if you are actually developing something in Ruby on Rails, you would have a different version of Ruby that is the version you need for your actual application. So we have system Ruby, and saying system Ruby just kind of makes my heart hurt a little bit. But there it is. And something that's basically meant for the application stack completely separately. Also, you have stacks that overlap in a different way. Different versions of software collections, or basically if things are packaged for OpenShift in one way and packaged for software collections in another way and they overlap, it's okay. We don't have to make them cage match it out to pick the best way. We ultimately want to have the best way, but right now we need to experiment with the different ways that are possible and match what people are doing and make those things available to people. It's possible that this spring we might have things provided in a way that is not even RPM. That's the case with a lot of the OpenShift things. Although OpenShift also uses RPM deployment stuff. But possibly if people are doing things in Ruby, we want to talk about letting them use Ruby gems because that's what people who are actually developing in Ruby do. And I'll talk a little bit more about Ruby gems in specific a little bit later on. And another important thing here is that stuff at the application stacks rings could have a different life cycle. And that doesn't necessarily mean they won't be rebuilt when we have a new Fedora release. But for example, if there is a software collection that implements Rails 3.4.3 and a specific version of Ruby, that software collection might be built for Fedora 20, Fedora 21, Fedora 22, so that if you have an application that runs under that, you can target that stack. And even though you upgrade your Fedora, because Fedora hits its end of life, your application will still go because you still have all the libraries that it expected to have. You don't have to rewrite. So right now we're going to Rails 4 in Fedora 20, and anybody who is targeting an earlier version of Rails and has to migrate their code for Rails 4, if they were actually using Fedora in production, which again, Robin always says people are using Fedora in production. People who are using Fedora in production are going to have to rewrite their code for the new version of Ruby on our schedule rather than on their schedule. And having people rewrite their code on our schedule generally means either they don't update and or more likely they go to some distribution where they can't work on their own schedule.
Or the third option is they just kind of say, screw this, install RBNB and just install gens there and keep using the old version.
Yeah, and keep using the old version, right?
Or the other option, they just don't upgrade.
Yeah.
Which is probably the worst.
Yeah, so we're not making the world a better place, which is really part of our mission in Fedora. And so we're kind of sweeping the problem under the rug by saying, not our problem, that's your problem. We're not gonna help you at all. So that's not great. Next slide. So the idea here is that the ring 2 will be sort of SIG-centric. SIG loves bubbles that within this ring that have their own policies. We don't want to just basically that every package gets to have whatever crazy exceptions. We kind of want to have a governance model where we have a SIG that's interested in this is how the SCL stuff is going to be put together. Possibly, or possibly language-based. I'm not quite sure how that will work out. We already have a lot of language-focused SIGs. So maybe the Ruby SIG will say we're going to focus on doing SCL. But an SCL SIG is something that would be interesting, and obviously an OpenShift would be interesting as well.
One possible advantage of that is that one of the interesting challenges with the language community is impedance matching the cross-platform upstream stuff with the Fedora-specific packaging, and that's where I think this could help.
Absolutely, because if we can work more in the way that the upstreams work, and we can have more people who are working in the upstream community invited into Fedora, rather than saying, if you want to cooperate with Fedora, you are going to learn to do things our way. And then we're really raising the barrier to entry in the Fedora community very high. And then basically they could say, never mind, I'm going to do the stuff that's fun over here in the thing that actually is what I'm actually working on. Yeah, making it focused around those language communities makes it easier to involve more people, which again is really the problem we want to solve for Fedora, not necessarily for the world overall. The selfish problem we want to solve, we want to get those people working with us. So next slide. So yeah, I mentioned the Fedora Commons there. This is basically a collection of packages that are not in that base design that follow the traditional policies and practices. So if you are a Fedora developer and packager and you are really happy with the way things are working and you think that it's good and you have a strong belief that building the perfect crystal castle that is Fedora is really making the world better, and that everything I'm talking about is horribly wrong and that it's awful to do it the awful way, that's fine. I think you can keep doing that. There's no reason we say we can't keep building the part of Fedora that we're building that way. There are a lot of people who are still interested in that model. And it also makes it nice, so we actually have those packages that are at the current level of packaging guidelines that other parts of Ring 2 can use if that's what they want to use. So I think that's good to have that through our Commons there.
I mean, in some ways, isn't this what you kind of want all the SIGs, almost like what you're kind of like the outer rings to kind of aspire to?
Yeah.
It's like, this is, I mean, what we would love is all of this stuff be magic and unicorn and rainbows. It just takes a while to get there, and so we want to support the getting there. But the goal is to get to here.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if, although some of the things where versions changing too fast, we may still need to work on and that kind of stuff. But yeah, especially with the bundled libs and some of the other possible exceptions, like we do want everything to end up being perfect and crystal, shiny rainbows and unicorns. But by basically saying until you've turned into a unicorn, you can't come play with us. There's a whole little story, right? I've got a 6-year-old. Yeah.
promise of stability for some of the stuff that's in Fedora Commons, right? Not perhaps we're never ever going to change, but there's a sense in which if we're going to be putting stuff into Fedora Commons, it's going to be used by lots of people and lots of projects. We don't want, perhaps V8 is a great example of this. As a lib, it changes pretty much in every commit that you Upstream Google. That's not probably something that's apropos for this.
Yeah, so
But then how do you deal with stuff like security issues that may be fixed in Upstream V8 with the newer releases? Do we then continue to ship what is a fairly core thing
I
of
think
security?
it doesn't belong in Commons yet.
Yeah,
Oh,
it,
right.
it belongs to other stuff in Ring
Yeah.
2,
Yeah.
but not part of Commons. Because
Yeah,
we have no
Control
opportunity or control
Yeah.
to say.
So it's possible there's some other layer or collection here. I don't want to go too far down rabbit holes before I'm done with the talk. If stuff we can hold to the end, that would be great. Sorry, comment?
This is slightly off topic, but I think predating even Fedora Core, the Fedora Core of old, there's in the e-learning space there's a learning object repository system called Fedora. If I remember this right, they got a bit pissed off when Fedora picked Fedora as a name because they were using it, and Fedora Core came out, and of course Fedora Core was much
So
bigger
they're
than
called
this
Fedora
little
Commons
Java
now,
based
so what you're saying?
Yes.
thing.
Alright,
And
okay.
so they switched name
Okay.
to Fedora Commons.
Alright, so, won't do that. We don't
Right, and this is the Java thing, upload.
We don't
Um,
need, okay,
you know.
we don't need to make the name again.
Yeah.
So
I don't know.
the name is just a placeholder. We can come up with.
How about
Yeah.
overhead?
Right, okay, let's just so not go down that road.
I mean, if you Google up Fedora
Yeah,
Commons,
okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
let's keep going.
that's fine.
Let's keep going now.
Time button.
Yeah, next.
Next slide.
Okay, so basically this is still on the ring too. There are a lot of different technologies here. So when I say there are many ways to do this, I mean these are ways that are worth things that I've talked to people about, and this isn't exhaustive, but these are some things that are really going on which are worth exploring in this ring. When I say really going on, it's to various degrees. Software collections is a thing that is really there, and basically there are people who are engineers who are just waiting for our policies to allow this to make it happen, waiting to package it up. So that's really ready to go. Stacks 2.0 is basically the next version of this using containers, and it is a not ready to go thing, but it's basically the idea for the future version of this that will solve all the things that are not pretty in software collections. So we want, that's not a thing yet, but we want to make room for experimenting with making into a real thing so that the problems with it can be worked out. OpenShift cartridges, definitely a thing. Again, Andy's talking from the plugin for it. Right, over plugging your talk. Yeah, okay. And then Fedora Formulas, which is again a little bit vaporware, but basically the idea using a collection of change management scripts that will solve a specific need. So if you want to make your system configured to have a LAMP stack, you choose this. It's sort of like Ubuntu's Juju, easy, quick provisioning of some solution, and building a community where we have a Git repository of these different formulas that you can apply to your system. This is something that is kind of is a pretty good idea, but needs some work.
So it's not similar to a whole lot of like Puppet scripts or Ansible scripts that people have contributed.
Yeah. And so the implementation let's talk about is Ansible Script. So basically a curated collection of Ansible scripts, and maybe some tools to apply them in a slick way.
One way that this kind of stuff has been done in other projects that shall remain unnamed is have they call them PPAs, like a little bit of blue.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. But a little bit of blue could
Yeah.
allow repositories
Yeah.
that are a bit hidden, and we don't have to argue, do we land
Yeah.
KD
So
4 or 5?
Right. So there's work on that probably should have gone on this slide. There is work on something called Coppers that is basically along those lines. And that was something that Seth was working on, so it's kind of in reevaluation right now about how we're going to make that actually happen. But it is something that we need as well, because obviously that's been a huge success for Ubuntu. And that probably is aligned with the Fedora Formulas thing, because that's maybe Fedora Formulas is a way to make your stuff that's in this Coppers repository go on a system. So yeah, that should have been on this slide as well. And again, traditional packaging, people who are really interested in still doing it the same way, if that's what you want to do, and we get a lot of people coming to Fedora, I want to package up my random thing, that's cool. And if it turns out 5 years from now that that way was right, good. I'm glad you're still contributing in that way, because we need that too. Next slide. Yeah, so this is sort of about these different approaches, kind of have a lot of different ways of doing things. Packaged software versus putting in version control. Some things we build on core versus overrides core. Some things replace things, some things coexist. So as we're talking about the policies for this, there's some useful buckets to divide this into and basically have maybe some categories that make the policies make sense based on what kind of thing you want to do. Like this builds on core versus replaces core is a pretty big thing. So if you're just saying, all I'm doing is building on core, we don't really need to worry so much about what you do. If you say, I'm replacing core, maybe we need to have a little bit more. If you want to replace core, here's how you do it in a way that will not make people confused and angry. So there are some different policies around these kind of things. This slide here is also for Toshio, who's not in the room, so we'll go on. Next slide. This is where we get kind of into future vaporware land, but Ring 3 basically completes the Ring thing where we have usable installable applications that are probably not RPM based. They're using the Linux apps things or just Git to deploy it into your own user account. And right now, basically, we don't have a great mechanism for that, and we do a lot of packaging applications into RPM. And again, as a system, and especially with the web-based stuff, we've got a whole bunch of things like photo galleries and blog software and all the things packaged up in Fedora. And it seems like a good idea, but every time I've tried to use one of those things in the real world, I end up wanting to hack on the code a little bit because that's just the way things are. And then really quickly it becomes a point where like, why didn't I just get this from Upstream in its in the source version control version of it? I would be making my life easier, whereas I've made my life harder by trying to use the system packages here. So if we can sort of shift away from spending all of our time packaging things up in a way that is not actually useful to people, and instead packaging them up in a way that's useful to people, like building them for OpenShift, then that would probably be a better use of our own time, at least. Again, if people really, really want to do it, that's fine. But if we want to make it, I think we should make it more slick to do it in another way and make that be the preferred way to get applications onto Fedora. And that's, again, a way we can invite more people into our ecosystem as well, because a lot of people are putting their code on GitHub, and a lot more than are packaging things up for RPM in Fedora. Next slide. So here's the picture of what that looks like. Very pretty. I had a whiteboard rainbow version of this that I drawn originally. I'm sorry, I didn't make that in the slide. So to put this all together, I think that if you want to look at what people get in the end, I think we want to have a spin-centric approach to this. And Steve Gallagher can talk about this a little bit more, sort of focusing on when you go to get Fedora, these are some use cases that are pretty big use cases right now. The Fedora desktop, developer IT desktop is what I have in mind. We can talk more about that. A cloud image and Fedora server, and these are the things. What's your use case? Here's the direction you go, and we design our releases around this kind of thing. We build on the common core design, but we market as these products here. And this slide is sort of a whole nother discussion. I just wanted to put in that we are going to have that whole nother discussion here because it's part of the concrete implementation of how do we get something useful rather than just a pretty picture of rings out of all this. The next slide. These are the concrete steps for where we actually want to go next. What do we need to do? What can we do right now? And what things do we need to work on a little bit further? And so next slide here. So here are some actual really specific things that can happen right now. We can start drawing this base design for core and say, here's what our base design is. This is what we mean when we're talking about the circle for Fedora. And basically have something that is that design document for Fedora 21. And this is kind of, in some ways, when we're talking about the big discussion about whether SendMail belongs in the default install of Fedora, one of the, basically the argument was, on the one hand, it's old, get rid of it, versus actually having something at user bin sendmail, whether it's sendmail or something else, is part of the standard Unix API that people expect, and that by not providing that, we're providing a failure to have Fedora as a coherent and useful platform. But the problem is we don't really have any definition of what we mean by that coherent useful platform. It's just sort of we know it when we see it, which becomes very frustrating to people. So I think it's time to put up and say, here's what we mean. And I think also that in the Fedora community, we've always had a lot of sysadmins and people coming from that background who are involved in Fedora and on the Fedora develop list. And those people are often very frustrated because they don't have a positive way to contribute in Fedora. And it becomes like my role in Fedora is to say, oh my God, don't do that. And right, and that's no fun for the people doing it, and it becomes sort of a whole dynamic of stop energy. You're the negative people who are holding back progress, when really it's not people who are holding back progress. Okay, some people's goal is holding back progress, but most of the people are saying this are actually coming from professional experience and wisdom and know what they're talking about, but haven't really articulated it in a positive way because there's not been a good outlet for articulating in a positive way in Fedora. So this is a place where if you want to contribute, if that's your viewpoint and you want to contribute positively, here's a way to do it by talking about what that design is for Fedora.
Do you really think it makes sense to like design the core before you know what is the core? I mean, we have to go back and first define the, like you had a previous slide, you had like the three use cases that people actually care about, the desktop, the server, and the cloud image. And that's what the core is for, right? So
yeah, so I
need to know what those
we need to do these things at the same time.
Yeah.
We can't just say, here's the core of nothing. Yeah, so I think having that focus is also important. That's why that was the previous slide. So, and we also need to make space for this Ring 2 innovation. We need a new working group for those policies, and I think we need to very quickly find a way to say that the people who are waiting to do things like software collections have some sort of way into Fedora, and it may not be, it may be something like what we do for ARM, where we say, okay, you're not a primary architecture right now, but you can use all the infrastructure like your primary architecture, and when it gets there, we say, okay, you're a primary architecture, rather than saying you've got to be perfect before you can even start working. So I think something that lets the software collections work in some way would be beneficial. Yeah.
I'm gonna say something a little provocative here. Okay. So it seems to me that there is sort of a natural shift that's happening here if you propose this model, where the stuff that goes in core is really just the stuff table Ring 2, right?
Yeah.
What we now know of as standard is really what's to enable Fedora Commons, whatever you call it, right? But the new definition of core, according to this model, actually is not to enable Fedora Commons, but to enable all of Ring 2.
Yeah.
Which you said, one of the things was there, one of the suggestions you had was something like not necessarily having to use RPM, which immediately then brings up this sort of interesting, just as an example, the idea that maybe RPM belongs in Fedora Commons and not in core. You know, there's sort of it's obvious about this, and I'm not trying.
I got a 10-minute warning that it goes, so let me finish my next couple of slides here. The final one here is emphasizing upstream relationships. I have the example of Ruby here right now. People who are doing Ruby tend to use gems and bundler, and they tend to check their gems into version control. And so right now, rubygems.org, basically the packages there are whoever wants to put stuff there can, and they get put into a package, and good luck. But that's what people are really using. So the low barrier to entry makes it very popular, and the easy to get them makes it very popular. But when we go to put these things into Fedora, we have to basically do all the, they're not useful for Fedora at all. We have to do all the code review. So a useful thing would be to actually take all of the work that we're doing in Fedora at code review for licenses and looking to make sure that it's not obvious malware, those kind of basic checks. And instead of doing them in Fedora, put the same amount of work into an upstream project, just like we try to do our code and patches upstream rather than doing them in Fedora. If we put that kind of stuff in, that packaging work at an upstream level, we get the same benefits of upstream there as well. So if we can work with rubygems.org and Sam, to make it so that
We're looking at you. Yes.
yeah, to make it so that, for example, there is a level of gems where somebody has looked to see that the license is a reasonable open source license, and basically, that this is obviously not something that's obviously meant to destroy your system, and that it comes from somebody that it can be traced to somebody in some way. Some of those basic things. Then we can start extending more trust to the upstream. One of the things in general we do in open source development, we do a lot of trusting of upstream. In Fedora right now, we review packages before they get in, but once the which is basically our way of saying, okay, this upstream is trustable. And once the package is in Fedora, if a new version comes out, we don't re-review it. And so if we can sort of widen that trust to some of the upstream, the language packaging models, that will make our lives easier. And that's something we can start working on right now, although we don't necessarily have the answer for it right now. The next slide. Here's the conclusion. Refocus core, make room for innovation with the rings, empower SIGs, blah, 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 blah. I said all this. Next slide. So here's my thanks. I really talked to a lot of people in doing this, and most of this isn't even my idea. It's other people's ideas that I've heard and kind of tried to put together and reflect back. I really want to thank Seth because I called and talked to him, and he, did the typical thing where he tells me it's a terrible idea and then tells me how to make it not a terrible idea. And I really appreciate that, and I'm terribly sad that I can't continue that conversation. Kind of a sad note to leave in the presentation. Let's go back to the other slide.
Where's the rainbow picture?
Yeah, I know, I did not put the rainbow picture in this. Okay, yeah, 5 minutes for questions, and we can continue this discussion more throughout the conference. Tim.
I don't want to seem like I'm anti this idea, but I'm hearing a whole lot of, oh wow, there's all this cool stuff, and where are the magical testers and QA people? And how are you?
Didn't use this.
Better than a 50-50 chance that this stuff's actually going to work when you try to install it.
You will because it's closer to upstream after the state.
You just remove everything that we're not actually testing now.
Well, okay, so it sounds like you can have multiple things at the same time. So what happens when I want to have, multiple, can you have multiple stacks installed at the same time? Not even getting up into the ring 3 in the application. I mean, I'm talking about getting down into some of either the ring 1 or ring 2.
Well, so straight up now.
Yeah, it's just, as a tester, I'm a little worried about what this is going to mean for my sanity going forward.
I think from a tester's perspective, right, or even from a Fedora perspective, if you think of the whole world of open source software, right, the rings are essentially designed to allow the whole world of open source software to exist on Fedora in that space. Right? And there's no way you're going to be able to test the whole thing. And so part of what we ship and what we include in what we test, I think, is sort of a foundational core, whether it's the Fedora Core or Fedora Core plus Commons. I think that's part of where we are. When we design the SIGs, right, the question is perfectly valid to say, do the SIGs, as they build their software, bring on some QA capacity as well, right? Because the SIGs are designing their own software and packaging their own software. That hasn't happened in the past because the SIGs don't necessarily.
Yeah, 6 don't.
Look, I'm not sitting here and saying it's a bad idea. I'm just saying we sat here for 50 minutes and there's been no talk about what's being tested. What kind of quality are we?
But I think that has a communications thing of the communications has to be the stacks are tested in isolation. Some very, very selected combinations may be tested to work together. The default assumption is that if you were using multiple things out of ring 0 and ring 2 and combining them on one system, the integration work is on you.
I mean,
Or beyond that, we should at least be making our best effort possible to make sure that they do not interact, that they are what they are.
But,
yeah,
leave
we-
effectively, I think.
Or when
I like
we
Spinner's
make
idea,
plans
leave it to
that
the
we're
SIG.
working with
Right.
QA and not just dumping it on.
No, I mean, it's leave it to the SIG, right? It's the responsibility of the provider of that thing to deal with the whole aspect of what they're doing. It's, for lack of, I love the word DevOps, right? No, but it's not your problem, right? It's the problem of the SIG. You might
Yeah, it's
well
not my
solve
problem,
the
but people complain to me when stuff doesn't work.
Right.
Now you-
So
it's not right.
I am answerable to,
but not responsible for, and how do you type?
like I said, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, I want to see more
That's their
stuff.
own problem.
Yeah.
That's not
What we're gonna do.
I mean, I think
How we're gonna do
that's-
it.
Dora's problem, but that was
Yay, chaos! More people.
It's not chaos, it's stacks.
Stop.
Good job, Matt. Make it so. Oh, here.